All right. Yes, thank you so very much, Sandy, for all your work putting this together. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I am very, very excited to be talking about in depth on depth. For those of you who don't know me, hi, I'm Colleen. I'm from Chandler, Arizona, so not too far away from you guys. And I am a full-time freelance photographer, writer, author, speaker, workshop instructor. I just have, I do a lot of fun things around trying to help people get outside. And so I'm an ex-software engineer, and as you'll see through the presentation, I tend to have a fairly analytical approach to my photography. And I'm hoping to share some ideas and thoughts with you about how to create better depth in your photographs, whether I'm going to talk about it in the context of landscape photography, but of course the things that I talk about here apply to all sorts of photography. So no matter if you're photographing birds or architecture, certainly the ideas that I'll present today will hopefully help you. So I'm going to start off with a question. Raise your hand if you have ever made a flat photograph before. Maybe once or twice. Yeah, it happens, and it happens to everybody, as it turns out. And it's because we as photographers are faced with a variety of challenges, and I'll point out 3 of them specifically. The first is that we don't see the same way our cameras do. Our cameras are monocular. They have a single sensor, and they produce a 2-dimensional photograph, length and width. There is no physical depth to a photograph on a screen. You know, you might have a print, but ultimately there is no physical depth to a photograph. We, however, see depth perception. We can perceive the spatial relationship between objects very, very clearly in our everyday life. And oftentimes when we set up a camera, we see the scene very differently than our camera will. And that is because our cameras record reflected light from objects. It don't actually record any objects per se, the way that we would perceive them. We might see a cactus, we might see cliffs, we might see rainbows, but our camera just sees light and shadow and the gradation between. And so it's recording light through pixels and data. We are assigning labels. We are the ones that see the cactus and the cliffs. Our camera could care less about those labels. And then the third part of why we tend to create flat images is that sometimes when we perceive objects, our eyes and our brains sometimes deceive us. And so this is one of my favorite optical illusions. This is the Hermann grid illusion. And the question for you is, where is the black circle? Where's the black dot? And you can see that it's moving all around. And so there are no black dots in this particular graphic, but our brain perceives that there is. And so sometimes what we think we see and what we really see differs. And artists over centuries have actually been tapping into the idea of optical illusions and creating depth cues. They've been doing this for a long time. So authors or painters like M.C. Escher, for example, have been incorporating these cues to create that sense of depth. I mean, if you see like the graphic of the hands, the hands look like they're coming right off of the page when in fact it's a flat painting or a flat drawing. And so if we know what these optical illusions are and we understand how humans organize what we see, which is often referred to as Gestalt psychology or human perceptions, then we can incorporate these depth cues and illusions into our photograph to create the illusion of depth in our photograph. And what this requires us to do, and you'll hear me talk about this throughout the presentation, it requires us to change our mind shift just a little bit away from this idea of identifying a primary subject into defining relationships among different subjects. Visual elements, I'll call them. And so that's because our viewers will see more than just our primary subjects. They're going to be taking in your entire image. And so everything that you do within the entire image matters and can help you create a sense of depth in your images. And so you're going to hear throughout the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about individual shapes, forms, relationships between these, not just a single dominant primary subject, but how the entire frame works together. So to kick us off in this sense, here's a pop quiz. What do you see first? Most people will see a black triangle. Some of you may see a hole in the page. That also is very valid, but most people will perceive there to be a black triangle. And so we would label this figure and then the white in the background as the ground. But if you saw the hole, then we would flip that. The figure would be that background, that white background, and the ground would be the triangle. And so when we think about this in terms of photography, what we're trying to do is really separate figure from ground, figure and ground. And you can think about it this way. The first thing you see in a photograph is generally considered a figure. And it's usually the thing that's in focus. It's maybe the brightest, it's maybe red. There's a lot of things that will grab our attention, but generally the thing you see first is considered the figure. The things that are supporting the figure are generally referred to as ground. And as photographers, we tend to label these in 3 different ways. We break it down into foreground, midground, and background. And so we can use this idea of this figure-ground relationship, which is defined as relating to or denoting the perception of images by the distinction of objects from a background from which they appear to stand out, especially in contexts where this distinction is ambiguous. And if you think about the types of scenes that we approach in the outdoors and nature, there's a lot of ambiguity, right? There's a lot of chaos. And so how can we embrace this chaos and make order out of chaos? And to do that, what we want to think about is kind of this figure ground relationship and how it works. There's a couple of laws, if you will, that the figure ground kind of adheres to. And the first is that what's deemed as figure versus ground is subjective. And so if you look at the optical illusion on the right, some of you will see a vase first, some of you may see 2 black faces. We see these at alternate times. We can't actually see the figure in the ground simultaneously. Our brain's not capable of comprehending that. And so the thing about this relationship is that a figure cannot actually exist without a ground. And we define this figure with contour and form. We don't pay as much attention to the ground. The figure is what gives ground its shape. And figure often appears closer to view than ground. I'm going to talk a little bit more about tonality and size, relative size and proximity, that will define that a little bit more precisely. And so when we think about how can we incorporate this, why does this matter in our own photography, separating figure from ground in our photographs, there's really 3 different things photographers should pay attention to. And it's lines, layers, and light. I'm going to go through each one of these individually, but it's important to understand that there is a relationship between these three. So in order for our camera to see light, we have to have a contrast between a highlight and shadow. Again, a camera is not going to see an actual physical line unless it sees a highlight and a shadow. So light is important to creating lines. Multiple lines working together will create shapes, and shapes working together will create layers. Layers then can be further separated by tonality, which I'll talk through again towards the end of the presentation. So these are the 3 things that we really, really want to pay attention to in our photographs. So I'm going to start with lines. Lines, I'm sure you've heard, are pathways for a viewer's eye to travel into the frame, and it should, this line should pay off somewhere of interest. So this bullwhip kelp in Oregon, it pulls us into this pile here, and we've got lines coming in from the sky. And so we spend most of our time back in here. There's some lines in the sand that pull us in as well. What we want to be careful of is those lines don't pull us out of the frame, because if that's where the line goes, that's where the viewer's eye is going to go. And we really want to keep our viewers hostage in the frame, right? We don't want them to leave the frame. And so we don't want that payoff to be somewhere outside of that frame. And so with lines, though, lines can do a lot more for us than just moving us around. They can create this sense of depth. And when that usually happens when we have multiple lines, specifically 2, could be 3 or 4, it just kind of depends on your situation. But we have multiple lines converging. This creates what's called a vanishing point. So in this boardwalk, again, our camera is not seeing the boardwalk, it's simply seeing the reflected light. But there's lines that are pulling us back into the frame. And so it feels like that little bench along the boardwalk and the trees in the background, they feel like they're further away from us than they actually are in the photograph. So M.C. Escher has a great painting that also uses multiple lines, and it just sucks you right into the painting, right? So there's no depth to this at all, but it looks like you're in a vortex, right? Like you're just getting sucked into the frame. And so multiple lines can work together to create a sense of depth. So when you're out in the field, pay attention to where your lines are moving around, how they're working within the frame, and how they're working together. And it's working together is what creates shape. It creates contour and boundary for shape. So in this case, we have multiple triangles together. This is just a bunch of lines our brain is perceiving. But with photography, especially, where we position ourselves in the frame relative, or in the field relative to our subject matter, can totally change how we convey a sense of depth. And so with shape, this is, just the same lines in a little bit different perspective. This is an optical illusion called the Necker cube. This is just a bunch of lines. There is no three-dimensional cube here, although our brain perceives that there is. That's the Necker cube illusion. I'm going to come back to the Necker cube illusion later when I talk about tonality. But for now, understand that when you're out in the field, pay attention to where your lines are going, but also how are they connecting to create shape, and how can you move around in order to create a sense of depth. And so how this works in the field is I'll be paying attention to triangles, I'll be paying attention to circles, I'll be paying attention to rectangles, and I'm trying to figure out the relationship between these different shapes, and I'm making decisions on whether or not I need to move based on the relationship between these shapes. So you can see I have a sequence of different triangles throughout this frame, and then I have a rectangle at the very top. And I can perceive these shapes and I can decide whether or not I like the balance. I don't see light, I don't see hills per se when I'm setting up. I don't see badlands, I don't see sand, I see shape. And these relationships between the shapes can help me convey a greater sense of balance within the frame. And one of the things that I did early on in my photography career is I shot a 4x5 camera, a large format camera. So it was upside down and backwards on the ground glass. So you can't tell a cactus from a cliff when you're doing that. And so that really trained my eye to see in shapes, and more importantly, the relationships between shapes. And as we define the shapes, it's important to understand that the absence of lines can create shape. This is called the illusory contour, and most of us will perceive that there is a white triangle, and there's no white triangle there. And we'll also perceive that there's a triangle behind it that's outlined in black. That triangle also doesn't exist. And then on top of that, we have the white triangle against these circles, which is creating sort of these Pac-Mans, if you will, also creating another layer and another shape that doesn't exist. And so our brain is putting this together to create multiple layers. This is called the law of closure in Gestalt psychology. We don't need to see the whole in order to understand what something is. And in this case, we don't need to see lines in order to see shape. Or in this case, we have multiple shapes working together to create layers. And so if you've ever heard, maybe you've heard when somebody's looked at your photograph has movement, you probably have a semblance of an illusory contour. So this is how this works. Your eye is going to go to the brightest part of the frame first, which is the sun, and then it's going to go to something big and bold. And this is, this plant that's seen obviously better days out in the Panamint Valley area in Death Valley, but the eye is going to keep going back and forth. This little guy back here is remarkably important to the success of this image. And so what happens is we get movement between that little guy and then the sun. And you can see here that I now have a shape in a triangle. And anytime I see three objects working together, you can do it with 4 or 5. Anytime you have multiple objects working together, you probably have the start of an illusory contour. And anytime I see this, I end up darkening around the edges of the frame on purpose to create a separate layer. Now, your viewers are not going to look at your photograph and be like, oh yeah, there's another layer there. They're going to perceive a sense of depth, though, subconsciously, that doesn't actually exist. And so I will create the Pac-Mans by painting in darker areas around these sort of focus points in processing. I also will put on, or instead, I will put on what's called a vignette. A vignette, I think, solves all world problems except for COVID. But a vignette is essentially a form of illusory contour. It's darkening around the edge of the frame. So I'm going to go, this is exhibit A, and this is exhibit B. And it's very, very subtle, but maybe at the bottom of the frame, you can see it most definitively. So you can apply a vignette in processing either through Lightroom or Camera Raw using the radial filter or exposure sliders. You can also do it through Photoshop, which is how I do it, through lens correction. And I do about a -20 on my vignette amount, but I just want a real subtle, having that darker area around the frame actually creates that separation that we need. It creates that illusory contour that creates a sense of depth that would not otherwise be there. It just kind of helps us along. And so when we have multiple shapes, we have to consider the relationship between those shapes. How are they working together? How are they overlapping? As you saw in the illusory contour, how they work together can make a difference in what we perceive is closest to us and farther away from us in a two-dimensional media. And so there's a few clues that I try to incorporate in my photographs: overlap, interposition, relative size, proximity, and texture gradient. So I'm going to talk about each one of those individually. But pop quiz, just to make sure you're still awake, which circle feels closest to you? Can you tell? Anyone?
B.
A lot of people will say B, and I think it's because it's red. A fair number of people won't actually be able to tell. And I have a hard time telling because it's the same shape. It's the same size. They're the same tonality. They're the same saturation. I think B grabs attention because it's red, and that makes a lot of sense. But what if I do this? Right? Most people now will perceive A to be in front of B, and this is called interposition, or as photographers, we call it overlapping or merging. It's an object that is partially obscured will be perceived as feeling farther away. And so, in a very obvious situation, this is layer upon layer in the Great Smoky Mountains. So, this shape is closer, this shape is closer to us than this one, is closer than this one, is closer than this one, is closer than this one. We can tell the layers just by the overlap. There's some lighting going on as well, which I'll talk about more in a bit, but we can't see the bottom of these hills, so we perceive them to be, number 6 to be farther away than number 1, even though this is a flat photograph. There is no dimension to the photograph, but it feels like you can walk into it and have some depth to it. As you're setting up in determining the relationship between shapes, we do want to watch out for mergers. Mergers can be really exciting in our photograph if they're done well and on purpose. Mergers that are accidental can cause problems. And so in this photograph, there's a few mergers going on. The one that's most dominant is the sunburst. The sun appears as if it's touching the horizon. And if the sun actually physically touches our Earth's horizon, we're in a world of hurt, right? So that is not reality. A merger is where we have three-dimensional objects, physical objects, appearing as if they touch in an actual photograph. And so there's other mergers here. We've got rocks merging here. We've got a tree touching the sky. We have a tree touching the sky. And the one that makes me absolutely insane is this one right here. And it's because it's right on the horizon. It's causing tension, visual tension. And it's grabbing attention when really that's not where I want you to look in this photograph. I mean, sure, I'd like you to stop there, but I definitely don't want you to sit there and wonder what's going on. And so how we can fix that in the field is to either get a little bit higher with your tripod or your camera, or get a little bit lower. Just create that separation between those three-dimensional objects that we perceive, but our camera doesn't. And so that will help get rid of that visual tension, that unnecessary visual attention. So, all right, so here's another pop quiz. Which circle feels closest to you now?
B.
Most people will say B. And this is called relative size. Larger objects look closer than smaller objects. And so when I'm out in the field, I'm trying to pay attention to the size of the shape, not just the shape itself, but what's the size of the shape. So this is from Cataract Canyon in Utah, a rafting trip that I did in March of last year. And I was out early. I had never been to this location before. This is the only time we were going to be there. So I really wanted to make a great image, in sort of challenging conditions. And so as I was setting up, I was paying attention to the shapes that I had at play. And so you can see that we've got some triangles going on here. Pardon my drawing skills. We've got sort of this odd shape here, and we've got a little bit of a semblance of a triangle up there, and we've got a triangle down here. And so when I start drawing those things out, when I'm perceiving those in the field, this down here, this foreground, looks smaller than this here, this cliff on the right hand side. And so the cliff feels as if it's physically closer to us in this photograph, which makes it very confusing because this is actually the closest part to us in the frame. And so I moved around, and you can watch this little rock right here, watch that guy right there. I'm just going to take a little bit, I'm just going to move my feet, take a little bit different perspective. So that's before, that's after. And I just made the bottom a little bit bigger shape. So I made it a rectangle and I made it much larger. And now that cliff over there is just much smaller in the frame. So it's not taking up as much space. And then we've got this relationship here on this side. So now I've changed the balance simply by moving over and tilting my camera down just a little bit to create that sense of depth. Now this foreground absolutely feels closer, and we get pulled into the cliffs and ultimately the light in the background. So hopefully this one feels like it has more depth than this one. This is a technically fine image, but this one feels a lot more effective to me when it comes to executing and conveying a greater sense of depth. All right, so here's another pop quiz on relative size. Which circle feels closer to you, A or B? Or which one feels bigger? Sorry. Which one feels bigger to you, A or B?
B.
Most people will say B. This is the Ebbinghaus illusion. They are exactly the same size. What this tells us is that the things around an object matter. And so when we surround a subject with bigger objects, like we see in the A example, then A is going to feel much smaller. That's how we can convey a sense of insignificant, of small, of feeling alone and isolation, is to surround your subject matter with things that are big, like negative space, for example. If we want a subject to really stand out, we surround it with things that are smaller, like we see here in the B example. So how I use this with my photography is I incorporate something called force perspective. And what this is really leveraging the distortion of the wide angle of my wide angle lenses. So I use a super wide angle, super wide being a 7mm. It's about a 14mm equivalent. I'm using a mirrorless camera, so it's a 2x conversion. And I get physically close to my object. I'm usually within a foot or two. So this foreground here is no more than maybe a foot away from my camera. And I stand up a little bit. I get about waist high, maybe a little bit higher, and I tilt my camera down. And then let me see if I have on the next slide. Yep. So what this does is this distorts reality, really. So these rocks here in the foreground in Acadia, they're only 15 feet, but what we see is, from that end of the rock to, sort of the horizon line, that's about 7 miles. And so this rock feels physically closer to us in the frame than the distance horizon. So people generally don't love this technique because it's challenging. It's challenging to manage depth of field, and you really want to manage your depth of field because it is tricky. You're in the field and you don't know where to focus. You don't know where to place your aperture. And if we focus too close, then it gets, we lose infinity. We lose the entire, we want the entire frame to be in focus, but we lose that. And so what I do is I have an app on my phone that I actually look up for my camera, for my for my lens focal length, and what aperture I'm using. It will calculate the hyperfocal distance for me. And so I will use the hyperfocal. That's the point you must focus at, such that half of that distance to infinity is in focus. And so I'll make sure that I have, this close range within that number, right? So making sure that I can get all the way from this point to this point in focus. And so that it makes the rock feel physically closer. And as you get physically closer to your subject, the other thing that it will do is it will help create a sense of texture. And there's something called a texture gradient. And it's when we can see very fine detail close to us, that when texture becomes less apparent, that feels farther away to us. And so when we have, when we get nice and close, these rocks are within a foot of my camera lens, then you can see the texture in the granite, right? And you can see the texture because of light and because of my focus. But as we get further away, we start to lose that texture. These rocks right here, this layer here has less texture, so it feels farther away. And then there's essentially no texture back in here. And so it's all the same type of rock, we just can't perceive it. And so it feels as if these rocks here are closer to you physically than the coastline in the background there. So, all right, so the way that we often see, or we can control texture gradient, is by physically getting close to our foreground elements, so filling our frame with things that are close to our camera, and then adjusting the depth of field. And sometimes having everything in focus actually creates a flatter image than if you don't have everything in focus. And one very easy example to see this in is in macro work, when we have, we use selective depth of field, where we have, a figure that's in focus that has lots of texture, and then we have a ground here that feels further away because we can see less texture, and even less texture in here. So this feels closest to us, this feels next, and then this feels furthest away. And so we can leverage that to convey that sense of depth in both landscapes and in macro scenarios. So how we can emphasize a texture gradient is through light and shadow. And so we get texture because we've got, topography in our rocks, or topography in our trees, and then we end up with texture, we end up with contrast, we end up with depth. And so most of us have heard that we should be focusing on incorporating light and shadow into our photographs, which is absolutely true. We definitely want to position ourselves, side light or backlight if you're photographing landscapes, front light if you're photographing wildlife, to reveal the texture and the form. But really, it's more than that to me. It's more than light and shadow. And here's an example of how light and shadow can work, but you can have the same, the same saturation level here, the same luminosity between A and B. And if we don't have a contrast between a highlight and a shadow, we don't have separation. So these are exactly the same shape, exactly the same size. The only reason why we perceive B to have any shape is that we've got this little bit of gray off to the side. We call that a drop shadow. This is just a gray line around B. And so we perceive B now, though, to be have depth, even when depth doesn't exist. This is a flat slide. There's no depth to it at all, but it feels as if B has depth to it. So yeah, so here we go back to the Necker cube. Tonality can help create context. So as you're moving around, you're moving your feet, you're changing the perspective of lines. Light can add to the context of the shape of those lines and the shapes themselves. And so here's an example. I'm going to put a little bit different tonality on the face of this. And so now it looks like the cube is kind of facing that way, right? Well, watch what happens if I change the tonality of another face. Now it feels like this cube is looking that way. Well, those are both right answers, but they're totally different in meaning. And so how you incorporate tonality, not just shadow, matters. And so when I'm out in the field, I'm paying attention to tonality. And so here's another pop quiz. Which circle feels closer to you? This is a tonality test. Any guesses?
A. Go away.
Most people will say A feels closer. Yeah, exactly. And it's because dark, heavier objects feel closer to us than light and bright objects. And so this is something I'm paying attention to beyond just shadow. Because there's lots of times we're out when we don't have really defined shadows, right? When we have even illumination, we have a cloudy day, we're in shade. So you can create a sense of depth by paying attention to the tonality, not just necessarily shadow. So here's an example of how I do this in the field and in processing. If I have an image, this is from last fall in the Smoky Mountains. It's one of my workshop participants. They're working the scene. And one of the things that I want to do in the field is I want to understand what my tones are doing in my photograph. And so I do what's called a tonality check, a tone check. And I change my view in my camera, my color profile to monochrome. I shoot in RAW, so my camera, when I click the shutter, is physically collecting all of the data. It's getting all of that information and putting it into, it's keeping things in color. But when I change the color profile, what I see on the back of my camera is a JPEG. And so it turns it into black and white. And I can see it in my camera, what's going on with my tones, and I can make composition adjustments. I can move my feet. I can think about visualizing what I'll do in processing, and I make adjustments in the field for that. If you don't do this in the field, you can actually do a tone check in your processing software. You can shoot it in RAW, you can convert it into black and white. This is a RAW file converted into monochrome so that you could see it as I did in the field. And what we're really looking for is a contrast between dark tones and light tones. So that contrast, here's a dark tone, here's a light tone. So we've got some separation here, but you can see in the background, things tend to get a little bit flatter. And even some of this water is just a little bit flatter than I feel like it needs to be. And so when we think about that in terms of, you can get it in the field, perhaps you move around, but I often leverage processing tools, specifically brushes, masking, burning, and dodging, to paint in depth. And so I want you to pay attention. I'm going to go to, this is the before, and I'm going to show you the after here really quick. It's very subtle. That's the after. Before, after. Can you see the difference? Before, after. And what I did, I want you to pay attention right in here. I painted, where's my drawing tool? I darkened the shadows very, very subtly right in this area. I did a little bit of work right in here. I'm going to leave that on so you can see the difference. There it is. Oh, I moved. Yep, there it is. Can you see that now? Did a little bit up in here too. Hang on. Did a little bit up in there too. Before, after. And that's really, really subtle. All I did was darken some of the areas. I lightened some of the areas just so that we could get a little bit more depth to the photograph so that those trees separated from the background. I do this a lot with my photographs. I will very specifically, I will get a map based on what I see in my RAW, based on what I see in the black and white. And then I make sort of a mapping, if you will, of where I want to dark and where I want to lighten my photograph. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. That's the 3 L's, lines, layers, and light. And I don't know if you'll necessarily get all of these little optical illusions in every single photograph, but it's important that if you do see them, that you're mindful of them and how they're working to help you create a sense of depth. So with lines, we really want to make sure that we're directing the viewer in and around the frame. And then we've got lines that create triangles and circles and all sorts of shapes out in the landscape. And we've got lines here, we got lines here. this little triangle here, this triangle coming in here. And so understanding the relationship of the shapes and how they work together to create layers. And so moving around can really help positioning yourself and just watching for mergers to make sure you don't have any unsightly overlaps. And then tapping into forced perspective. This is a forced perspective image. I got really, really nice and close to this rock. This rock is much, 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 much smaller than this island in the background, so it feels like it's more distant. This feels closer to us than that island does. And so you can also see some texture, you see some light, so there's lots of clues as to why that rock feels closer to us as opposed to that island, even though this is simply a two-dimensional image. And if you can't get the shape that you want in the field, then follow the natural, the natural shadows. You can darken this area here, you can lighten this area and here, darken, lighten all the way throughout the image so that you get that separation in tones by dodging and burning in process. So looking for not only shadow, but also tonality separation. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. If you would like some additional resources on this, there are a number of books out there, one by Arnheim, Art and Visual Perception. There's Perception and Imaging by Richard Zakia. Art and Visual Perception is kind of the Bible for this kind of stuff, and it's just kind of an academic read. It's a kind of a slog to get through. Really, really, really great and important information, but it's a bit of a slog. Whereas Richard was a student of Arnheim, and he wrote a book. He happened to be also a photographer, so he wrote Perception and Imaging, and that's, if you can get your hands on it, that's maybe a little bit more of a Cliff Notes version of Art and Visual Perception. And then if you like the idea of trying to understand how we see and perceive the world, it's not necessarily a photography book, but Margaret Livingstone has a great read called Vision and Art. There are also two, I'm going to give you guys this recording. I'll process it and send it off to Sandy, but so you have this as a resource to refer to. But there's also two articles that I did quite recently, one for Out of Chicago and one for my Dear Bubbles column that talk a bit about how to create a sense of depth in your photographs. So there's two resources there. And Dear Bubbles actually has, I'm going to shamelessly self-promote. Dear Bubbles is my online advice column for photography, art, and the creative life. And I take questions from my community and I answer them. I was answering them once a week throughout the pandemic. And then as my travel schedule kind of increased, went back to normal, I've started doing it once a month. So last year I did it all once a month. But there's like 60, 70 different columns on a variety of topics. Everything from, how to use filters, depth of field, why do I suck? Like it's just all sorts of questions. I'm going to actually be releasing one tomorrow. Tomorrow's the first Wednesday of February. So if you are interested, head over to Dear Bubbles. If you have any questions, I'm going to take questions here at the end of the presentation. But if you have any questions after the presentation, definitely send me an email. And you never know, you might get featured on Dear Bubbles and help not only yourself, but the broader community. And we're all kind of in this together. So it's really, really a fun thing. If you like the presentation, I've been doing more of these throughout the pandemic. I've been doing webinars for my own community as well as for camera clubs. And I have a variety of those that I recorded live. And so the recordings are available if you'd like to go back and look at those on loads of different topics. I just did a live webinar called Making the Photographs the 2021 edition. And so if you're interested in getting notification of those webinars, jump on my website. You can get on my newsletter, and that's the best way to get notified of those. I do have 3 webinars that are free and that are out there. Critiquing Your Own Work, which was my very, very first webinar of the pandemic. No More Rules in Human Perceptions and Composition, and Visualization, Picture the Possibilities. The last 2 I did through Stingray. They hosted both of those presentations, visualization being the most recent. So lots of different options to continue your learning. If you'd like to come back out into the field and put these things to practice, to use, I am back to field-based workshops. All of the field-based workshops I'm doing right now are outdoors. I've eliminated the indoor components entirely. So just to keep people safe as we get through this pandemic. But I have, of all of my workshops workshops, I only have one spot open in Southern Oregon, and that's due to a cancellation. Otherwise, I have a couple of online conferences coming up that do have some availability left. The online conferences actually are kind of unlimited in terms of attendees. So I have a night photography summit that I'm doing this weekend. I'm actually talking about creativity. I'm not talking about night photography at all. But that's going to be a really great lineup. And then the out of Chicago events are always fun. But like I said, like with the webinars, if you are interested in getting notified of the workshops, definitely join my newsletter. And you can do that through my website. And if you are not excited about getting out of the field, but want to keep learning, I do produce books. I write books, photograph for books. And last year was especially busy. I run a publishing company. Analemma Press is my publishing company. And so last year we put out 3 books. I did a second edition of my Photographing Acadia book. I did an exhibition catalog for my Current Flows, Water in the Arid West, which was in conjunction with an exhibition in Colorado, in Pueblo, Colorado, that opened for Vital Waters that featured Ansel Adams, Ernie Brooks, and other black and white photographers. Both shows, Current Flows and Vital Waters, were curated by Jean Falk Adams, and Jean is Ansel Adams' daughter-in-law. So I've had the chance to actually stay in Ansel Adams' Carmel house, and it was kind of mind-blowing. I did that last summer, and it was all sorts of craziness. So, but anyway, the last book that I published was with a buddy of mine, Guy Tall. I produced this book for him, with him, called Another Day Not Wasted. If you're looking for inspiration, motivation, it is decidedly not a how-to photography book, but it absolutely is rich in inspiration and inspiration. Kind of a lot of the philosophy of life. If you don't know Guy's work, definitely look him up. He's a remarkable photographer and writer, but he's just really brilliant when it comes to philosophy of life and philosophy of photography, which tends to blend together for us. So, all right, that's my story. I'm sticking to it. If anybody's still awake, I'll take some questions. This is how you guys can find me afterwards. I'd love to stay in touch, but yeah, if there's any questions, I'd love to entertain them now.
Okay, how can we do questions now?
You
you hear
take
me?
them, and I will repeat them.
Oh, okay. Questions. Pardon me? What did you say?
When does she sleep?
Oh, when do you sleep?
Oh, I have another blog called You Can Sleep When You're Dead. I do. I really do. No, I mean, this is so fun. That's the thing. It gets so fun that there's just so many fun things. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
Fantastic presentation. Yeah.
Fantastic presentation.
Oh,
said.
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully you got some new ideas on how to incorporate depth. I mean, there's some fun things in there, right? Like there's some illusions that are pretty cool.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again. Well, maybe next year this pandemic will be over with and we'll have you live.
Yes. Yes.
I'm sure you'll have something new by then.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I just appreciate your support over the years. And of course, throughout the pandemic, it's just really meant a lot to me. And we just keep going the way we can. So.
And I want to tell everybody that I have all of her books, by the way.
Yes, she does.
I don't think they're all here, though. I think I might have some in Wisconsin. But anyway, I have a lending library. If you want to own your own, certainly look onto the website, and they're really worth having. Especially when are we going to get wildflowers? Are we? Tell me.
Oh yeah, might be a tough year for that. If we do get them, we'll get them at the end of February and in March. Our concern is that we got actually a fair bit of rain last year, at the end of last year. We just didn't get it at the right time. And then we've had like 3 days of freeze in January. And so I don't know. We'll see. I don't know that it's going to be a great year for poppies, but the perennials will love the rain that we did have. The perennials like, brittle bush and the cactus flowers and things like that. So, we might see some scattered perennials. I just got back from Death Valley, and on the way back down from Vegas and Kingman, I was starting to see brittle bush blooms. So that's a decent sign. I mean, it's right along the road where the water collects, but still that's a decent sign that we've gotten some rain. So that they're
Okay.
happy about. So we'll see. Fingers crossed. Do your rain dance.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Thank you again. Bye
All
now.
right. Yep. Yep. Have a good
Bye.
day.